Politics are pretty much driving Trump's tariffs. What are you making of the messaging that we're close to perhaps a major trade deal, and perhaps the messaging of the optimism that something will come out of the trade negotiations of the weekend within the U.S. and China?
Well, there's a fundamental issue with China that we don't have with other countries. We've become enormously dependent on Chinese imports, not only for low prices, which is great value, but also as components in our industrial plant. There is a danger, as there was during the Arab oil embargo, that in spite of economic interests of the Arabs, they cut off oil to the United States. We don't expect the Chinese to do that, but we still have to understand that whereas there has to be a financial understanding, there also has to be a geopolitical understanding. The United States and China are mutually hostile in the security area. Not at war, but not friends. And there is always, in financial dealings, a weapon in finance and economics that can be used against the other country. The incredible dependency the United States has in Chinese low prices and efficiency opens the door that if the geopolitical situation shifts, China might limit exports to the United States as a weapon. And I think that has a major dimension to do with it. And this is not just a financial crisis with China, not just an economic one. There is a serious security and geopolitical issue that we have to address. Both have to be solved to solve this problem.
The thing is, both sides have acknowledged that such high tariffs are not sustainable. It is in both countries' interest to make some progress on the trade tensions. Victor, given that the trade negotiations over the weekend in Switzerland is at a high level, what are the chances of some progress being achieved, even if it's just in terms of the positive messaging that may be sent across to the world?
Thank you very much for having me. For the Chinese high officials and the American counterparts to meet this weekend in Switzerland is, in my best judgment, a positive step in the right direction. However, if you read between the lines, the Chinese side does not call it a negotiation. They call it getting in touch with the United States at the request of the United States, meaning they want to tone down any expectation that whatever that comes out of Geneva or Switzerland will be of any great significance, because there is no negotiation. The Americans wanted to talk, and China agreed to meet halfway. They do not want to go to Washington for the talk. They do not want to allow the Americans to come to Beijing for the talk. They want to go to Switzerland for the talk. And if you read how the Chinese frame it, they actually say the Chinese leader, Mr. He, will go to Switzerland for China-Swiss consultation, to be followed with China-French consultation in Paris. And in between, they happen to be in Switzerland, and they want to meet the American counterpart at the insistence of the United States. Now, what does this mean? My best reading is that China is fully committed to fight this trade war with the United States to the very end, if the United States chooses to do so, or China wants to open the door for real negotiation on terms of equality, mutual respect, and for mutual benefit. So we are at this critical moment when China agrees to get in touch with the American counterparts for the possibility of real negotiations. Whatever that will happen in Switzerland will not be called real negotiation at all by any stretch of the imagination, but it will be absolutely in both China's interest and Americans' interest to scale down the tariffs to make sure that free trade prevails, and no one should be allowed to weaponize trade or weaponize tariff or to throw a big wedge into free trade. This is the best message I can get out of this weekend's meeting in Switzerland.
George, do you agree it's not negotiations that we're seeing this weekend within the U.S. and China, bearing in mind as well that both have maintained a pretty hot stance in terms of what and how far they're willing to go?
I think whatever we call it, it's both sides talking to each other. And if you don't want to consider it negotiations, well, nothing will be settled here anyway. It has to go to much higher levels. But again, the Chinese are approaching this as basically a financial confrontation between the United States. There are more dimensions to this confrontation, and they will be risen. For the United States, there are two dimensions, and for the Chinese, there's only one. So that the more the Chinese try to limit this to financial issues, and the more they stand as if they don't have much to lose, as much to lose as the United States, which I don't think is true, the harder the negotiation will be. So whatever the Chinese formal position is, it is diplomatic preface. But the fact is, these are the first talks. What will come of them will be further negotiations, but the negotiations are going to be much more complex than with most other countries.
As you suggested, George, there's a lot to lose for China, but it does seem like China is also preparing itself for a long, drawn-out and tough negotiation process, because we've just seen from the PBOC all those measures which, were more than people expected. It does seem like it is trying to set its economy up for the long haul. Is that a fair assumption?
In any negotiation, you want to go in as if you don't need a deal and you have all the time in the world. Whether you're buying a house or a company, you don't go in there eager for a settlement. But it's very difficult for me to imagine that China, as dependent it is both on American trade and in the past on American investment, can afford to have a breakdown in economic relations with the United States. So I would say that what we are saying, what politicians say is that there is something they think and something they say. I tend to disregard what they say. I take a look at their position. And the Chinese can't afford, any more than the United States can, a long and extended conflict between them economically or politically and militarily.
Victor, we heard George say earlier that negotiations has to be brought up to a much higher level. By that, we mean perhaps, right, it has to be at the level of the two leaders here. We're talking about Xi Jinping as well as Donald Trump. Can a deal be struck only at that level?
Well, a couple of points, very briefly. I think for China and the United States to yank the tariff against each other on the Chinese side up to 125%, on the American side to a higher percentage, cannot be done without the personal approval of the top leaders of each of these two great nations. That's the first point. The second point is China has declared again and again and again that if the United States want to manhandle this free trade issue, China is prepared to fight to the very end. Now, the question is, what is the very end? What are the possibilities of the very end? Let me really think aloud for the benefit of your audience. I think, according to the Chinese interpretation, one of the end will be the two-way trade between China and the United States grinding to a complete halt. That means there will be no more Chinese exports to the United States, and there will be no more US export to China. Now, does China want to see this happen? Absolutely not. It's against China's own interest. But allow me to emphasize, China has another higher interest. That is free trade. China will never allow any country, no matter how powerful that country is, to really throw a huge wedge into free trade as if it can dictate terms to the rest of the world by holding a gun at China's head or any other country's head. That means the end will be a complete halt and termination of two-way traffic. Now, the United States probably says, well, I want to boycott Chinese exports to the United States or some of the Chinese export to the United States while continuing to have a free walk of American exports to China. That will be completely pipe dream. If it comes to a halt, it will be halting the two-way traffic at whatever economic cost to China, because China will believe that is the only right thing to do, and no country in the world should be allowed or permitted to fight and destroy free trade.
George, What's your take on the end that Victor was talking about? And could China be willing and happy to sacrifice its exports to the U.S. if it means gaining, a strategic footprint, a bigger footprint in the world?
Well, from my point of view, this is a very reasonable opening in negotiations. You both sit down and say, I don't need a deal. The price that China would pay for losing access to the American market would be substantial. So would the price that the Americans would pay. But if the Chinese are absolutely capable of cutting off supplies to the United States, that creates a greater imperative for the United States to back off Chinese trade. Then we must be self-sufficient. Then we must not be importing. So this threat by the Chinese is an argument against free trade, in the sense that if some country shifts out of that, dangers could happen. And that's exactly what the United States is worried about in relation to China. And if it's what China is worried about the United States, then we can talk. So long as we both have the same fears, it's possible to reach an understanding of what will happen. And I think US and China have the same fears. We both fear a breakdown in economic relationships. We both fear war between the two countries. We have much more in common just because each side is being inflexible. Then they will sit down and find a middle ground.
George, I want to refer to your book, The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, The Coming Crisis of the 2020s, where you talk about how the U.S. periodically reaches a point of crisis where it appears to be at war with itself, and it is about a country perhaps in transition, reinventing itself. The other take, of course, is whether or not it is actually in terminal decline. How are you looking at those two ideas?
When we look back at the Roosevelt period, or the Reagan period after the Vietnam War, it always appears that the United States is in decline, and the world sort of welcomes it. But the fact is that the United States is a country that invented itself. In our revolution, we created a constitution, and we reinvent ourselves as resources and as institutions become obsolete. So rather than having a long-term evolution, we have short-term crises. We had that when Reagan was elected 50 years before that when Roosevelt was elected, and so on and so forth. This is a healthy way in which the United States operates. It is not the way the rest of the world operates. And in this time, there is strife within the United States. Roosevelt was called a dictator, and he went to war with the Supreme Court. So I would say that this is the norm for the United States. It is not the norm for other countries. And they draw imperfect conclusions if they think this represents weakness in the United States. This is one of the strengths of the United States. We're not afraid to have chaos in the process of reinvention.
Victor, even as we cast our eyes at the upcoming U.S.-China trade talks this weekend, the U.S. itself is in the midst of negotiating with at least a dozen economies. I'm just wondering, what's the take from China, given that there is a sense that the U.S. is likely to gather its trading partners and try to isolate China, especially on the issue of chips?
First of all, allow me to mention one point from the depth of my heart. For China, with its size, with its strength, with its deliverability, and with its 5,000 years of history, when we hear about any country or any groups of countries talking about isolating China, do you know what's the response? We chuckle, because from my perspective, it's a mission impossible. You dare to isolate China? You're talking about kind of isolating the world in a sense. China is the largest trading partner with more than 140 nations in the world. And you want to isolate China? You want to really break up all these economic relations? It's a fantasy. Never try that, because otherwise you'll end up in great failure. Now, on the other hand, yes, we know that the United States is talking with many countries, but for the United States to launch this unprecedented, largest scale tariff war or trade war, it's like holding a gun at every country's head and say, kneel down and talk to me on my terms and don't strike me back. Now, every country faces different circumstances, many countries, it will not be surprising, will need to give in to the pressure of the United States. But you ask them in the bottom of their heart, in the depth of the night, whether they like to have a gun pointed at their head, I can assure you, based on all my education, all my judgment, all my sanity, all my wisdom, no country likes to have a gun pointed at their head to negotiate with the United States. Therefore, I hope I can tell President Trump and people around him, don't struggle against free trade. Follow the principle of free trade. And the United States seems to be a standard bearer of free trade for many decades.
Right.
Now, the standard falls into the hands of China, and China wants to be the champion and the standard bearer of free trade. This is the difference we are talking about.
Lots of complications for the world right now, including what's happening in South Asia, the conflict between India and Pakistan. George, let's start with you. When it comes to the role that the U.S. can play, how do you think it can, what can it do to help de-escalate the tensions there?
Well, the United States wants to not dominate the world, not frighten the world, not point guns. It wants to pull back from the world. For the last 80 years, the United States has been in a Cold War, a war that frequently turned hot, where many Americans died, other countries died. And the United States has the ability not to reshape the world, but to reshape itself. And one of the features of the United States that makes it such a great power is when it reshapes itself and it reshapes its relationship with the world seems shocked, as if it's unreasonable. But we have been in a Cold War for a long time, and that's why we are trying to negotiate with the Russians and back out of this war with in Ukraine. And this is why we're trying to negotiate with the Chinese. So if the Chinese don't want to negotiate, well, that's their choice. But it is American options for what they want to do that is driving this. It is not holding a gun to the head. It is trying to take a different course in history. And that is the right of every sovereign country, China included. China will decide what it has to do, but there's no gun being pointed at their head.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Great insights. Victor Gao from the Center for China and Globalization and George Friedman of Geopolitical Futures.